When I handed Brendan the keys to my house, I did so with a heart full of trust and hope. I believed that my son, the boy I had raised with such care and patience, would honor the responsibility I was giving him. The house, with all its worn floors and familiar corners, was more than just a structure. It was a repository of our shared memories, laughter, and even the quiet moments of understanding that don't need words. I thought that by entrusting him with the keys, I was inviting him to be a part of my life, not to shut me out. But when I returned home earlier than expected, bags in hand and thoughts of surprise hugs and warm welcomes swirling in my mind, I was met with something far colder. The front door, which had always stood open for me, or at least unlocked, was now firmly locked. I jiggled the handle, hoping it was just a mistake or that Brendan was inside, waiting to welcome me back. But there was no sound, only the stubborn resistance of the lock, as if the house itself had turned against me. Taped to the glass panel beside the door was a note, folded neatly but with no warmth in its words. It read simply, "Sorry, Mom. No space for you anymore." My breath caught, and the suitcase in my hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy. The words hit me like a physical blow, each syllable echoing off the walls of my heart. "No, we love you," or "we'll talk soon," just an icy dismissal that severed any lingering hope I had of being part of their lives. I stood there, stunned, the evening light fading and casting long shadows across the porch where I had left my dreams of a family still connected. The door that had once welcomed me home now felt like a barrier, a symbol of the distance that had quietly grown between Brendan and me. I tried to peer through the windows, searching for any sign of life inside, but the curtains were drawn, hiding whatever plans they had made without me. Inside, the house was supposed to be alive with the sounds of my family, the clatter of dinner dishes, the murmur of conversation, the familiar creaks of the floorboards as Brendan moved about. Instead, it was silent. The air felt stale, as though the warmth of our shared history had been sucked out, leaving only emptiness. I could almost hear the ghost of my own footsteps, the fading echo of laughter that once filled those rooms. I remembered the times I had cared for Brendan with unwavering devotion, the nights I stayed up listening to his worries, the mornings I packed his lunch with a smile, the countless sacrifices I made to give him a better life. I had believed that love was enough to hold us together, that trust would never be broken. But now, standing on the porch, I realized how little I had seen beneath the surface. The subtle changes in his tone, the missed calls, the excuses, they had all been warning signs I had chosen to ignore. The note felt like a final verdict, a declaration that I was no longer welcome in the life I had helped build. The calm I had felt before leaving had evaporated, replaced by a sharp, aching sense of betrayal. I had been cast out of my own home, not with confrontation or explanation, but with cold silence and a folded piece of paper. I sank onto the wooden steps, my suitcase resting beside me. The evening air was cool against my skin, but it couldn't cool the fire of hurt and confusion burning inside. I thought about calling Brendan, but the note made it clear that any attempt to reach out would be unwanted. I thought about knocking again, pleading for a conversation, but the locked door spoke louder than words ever could. Memories flooded me then, Brendan's first steps in this very house, his teenage years spent dreaming aloud in the backyard, the birthdays we celebrated around this same kitchen table. Each memory was a thread in the tapestry of our family, now fraying at the edges. I realized with a painful clarity that the bond one had believed unbreakable had been quietly, deliberately severed. As the sky darkened, I sat there, the weight of loss pressing down on me. I was no longer the mother who walked freely through these halls. I was a stranger to the home I had built. The trust one had placed in Brendan was shattered, replaced by a silence that screamed louder than any argument ever could. I felt tears welling up, but I swallowed them back. There was no audience for my pain here, no one to witness the unraveling of a mother's heart. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling, but the screen felt as cold as the note that had greeted me. I was alone on that porch, caught between the life I had known and the uncertain path ahead. The night deepened, and with it came the realization that this was not a momentary lapse or a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate choice on Brendan's part, to lock me out, to erase my place in his life, without so much as a conversation. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined, a wound that no amount of time could easily heal. I thought about the house itself, the walls that had witnessed so much of our story. It was no longer a sanctuary, but a silent witness to my exclusion. The keys I had given Brendan, once symbols of trust and connection, now felt like instruments of my own displacement. As I sat on those steps, the echoes of the past mingling with the harsh reality of the present, I understood that the journey ahead would be one of reckoning. I had to confront not only the loss of my home, but the loss of the relationship I had treasured above all else. The locked door was a barrier not just to a physical space, but to the sun I thought I knew. The night grew colder, and I wrapped my coat tighter around me, drawing a shivering breath. The porch light flickered overhead, casting fleeting shadows that danced like ghosts of the family I had lost. I clung to the hope that somewhere beneath this cold refusal, there was still a chance for understanding, for reconciliation. But for now, all I had was the silence and the locked door, a stark reminder that love alone does not guarantee belonging. In that moment, I felt a profound loneliness, a sense of being cast adrift from the life I had built. The house, once a haven, was now a fortress keeping me out. And yet, despite the hurt, despite the shock, I knew I had to find a way forward. I had to gather the pieces of my shattered trust and face the reality that had been thrust upon me. The night stretched endlessly, and as the stars blinked coldly above, I made a silent promise to myself. I would not let this betrayal define me. But for now, on that porch, with the note still fluttering in the breeze, all I could do was sit and mourn the loss of a home that no longer welcomed me. That first night, I found myself wandering toward the small park just a few blocks from the house, the place Brendan and I had often visited together when he was younger. The bench near the old community garden, where we had planted sunflowers and herbs side by side, became my reluctant refuge. I sat there wrapped in my coat, the chill of the evening seeping deep into my bones, but it was nothing compared to the cold isolation settling in my heart. The garden, once a vibrant patch of green and color, seemed subdued under the moonlight, much like my own spirit. I traced my fingers over the rough wood of the bench and let my mind drift back to those simpler days when Brendan's laughter had filled the air, and I had felt certain that our bond was unbreakable. How had it come to this? How had the space between us grown so wide and silent that I was now an outsider in my own life? I thought back to the subtle signs I had missed or ignored, Brendan's increasingly curt replies to my calls, the way he avoided spending time with me, the excuses he made when I suggested visiting or sharing a meal. I had chalked it up to the stresses of adulthood, work pressures, or a busy social life. But now I understood that those moments were cracks forming beneath the surface, fractures that had widened into this chasm of rejection. I recalled one particular evening, not long ago, when I had arrived unannounced, hoping to surprise him with dinner. He had barely looked up from his phone, muttering that he was tired and needed space. I had left quietly, telling myself it was just a rough patch, that he was overwhelmed. But maybe, deep down, I had sensed the distance growing and had chosen not to confront it, fearing the truth would hurt too much. The park was nearly empty, save for a few late-night wanderers and the occasional bark of a distant dog. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to hold on to some sense of warmth, not just from the cold night, but from the memories that still flickered within me. I realized that I had been clinging to the hope that this estrangement was temporary, that Brendan would come around and open the door again, both literally and figuratively. But dawn brought a quiet, painful clarity. As the first pale light crept over the horizon, I understood that what Brendan had done was not an impulsive act, but a deliberate choice. The locked door and the note were not mistakes or misunderstandings. They were firm boundaries he had set, marking me as unwelcome. My sanctuary was gone, and with it, the comforting illusion that family ties were unbreakable. I spent the early morning hours walking aimlessly through the neighborhood, each step heavy with the weight of my new reality. Passing familiar houses and yards, I felt like a ghost moving through a world that had moved on without me. I thought about the life I had built here, the friendships, the routines, the quiet joys, and how suddenly it all seemed out of reach. There was a moment when I paused outside a townhouse down the street, one Brendan and his partner Kayla had once mentioned considering as a future home. Through the window, I caught a glimpse of their silhouettes, heads bent together over what looked like blueprints or brochures. They were making plans that didn't include me. The sight hit me with a fresh wave of grief. I had missed the signs, the whispered conversations, the subtle shifts in their lives that had slowly edged me out. Questions swirled in my mind. Had they already decided I was no longer part of their future? Had they been quietly erasing me from their lives while I clung to hope? The thought was unbearable, yet I couldn't turn away. I stood there longer than I intended, watching the life that once included me unfold without me. As the day wore on, I found myself reaching out to old acquaintances, searching for understanding and perhaps a thread to hold on to. An unexpected encounter with Martina, a former colleague, brought some clarity. Over coffee in a quiet cafe, Martina shared what she had heard from Kayla, excitement about the new house, confident that I had already moved out and that the transition was smooth. Martina's words were a bitter confirmation of my fears. The assumptions they had made, that I had simply stepped aside, felt like erasures of my very existence. It was clear they had moved forward without telling me, not waiting for a conversation or a chance to explain. I realized then that I could no longer rely on hope alone. I needed to uncover the truth and reclaim my place. Determined, I began to investigate quietly. I contacted the local post office to check if any mail addressed to me had been redirected or withheld. I visited the utility company to see if my name was still on the accounts. Each inquiry revealed small but deliberate changes: my name missing from bills, notices sent elsewhere, official documents altered. It was as if someone was systematically erasing my connection to the home and the life I had known. The growing realization was both terrifying and galvanizing. I was not just being locked out physically, but being stripped of my identity within this family and this place. The house that had been my refuge was now a battleground, and I was forced to confront the painful truth that this was not a temporary estrangement, but a calculated exclusion. Yet amid the despair, a flicker of resolve began to burn. I knew I had to fight not just for the house, but for my dignity and my right to belong. The betrayal stung deeply, but it also awakened a strength I hadn't fully recognized in myself. I wasn't going to disappear quietly into the shadows they had cast. That afternoon, I returned to the park, sitting once more on the weathered bench near the garden. The sun was warmer now, and the flowers seemed to lean toward its light, resilient and unyielding. I took a deep breath, feeling the sharp edge of loneliness still there, but tempered by a budding determination. I would seek answers, gather support, and find a way through this. The path ahead was uncertain and the wounds fresh, but I understood that survival meant embracing both the pain and the possibility of healing. As I looked around the quiet garden, I thought about the seeds Brendan and I had planted together long ago. Maybe, just maybe, some of those seeds could still take root, even in the hardest soil. I stayed until the sun dipped low again, feeling the shift from despair to cautious hope. The journey was just beginning, and though the night had been long and cold, the dawn had shown me that I was not yet lost. I had to keep moving forward, even if the way was unclear, even if the home I once knew had been taken from me. And so, wrapped in the quiet of that familiar park, I settled into a fragile resolve to face whatever came next, holding on to the memory of better days as both a comfort and a reminder of what was worth fighting for. I needed answers, and so I reached out to Mrs. Lambert, my elderly neighbor who had lived 3 houses down for over 30 years. She had always been a quiet observer of the neighborhood, someone who noticed the small things others overlooked. When I explained my situation, her eyes softened with sympathy, and she nodded knowingly. "I've overheard bits and pieces," she said in a hushed voice during our meeting at her kitchen table. "Kayla and Brendan have been talking about the house for months now, planning to make it theirs." I thought it was just talk, but I didn't realize how serious they were until recently. Her words hit me like a fresh wave of cold water. They had been scheming behind my back, turning plans into action while I was left out in the cold. Mrs. Lambert described how she had heard Kayla mention changing the locks and Brendan bragging about having the deed transferred. The pieces fell into place with a sickening clarity. This was not a moment of anger or confusion. It was a calculated betrayal. Determined to uncover the full truth, I asked Mrs. Lambert if she could help me discreetly gather any information. She agreed, offering to keep an ear out for any conversations and share whatever she learned. It felt like a small lifeline, a connection to the world I was being pushed out of. Next, I turned to the local legal aid clinic, a place I had never imagined needing but now found myself sitting in, clutching my handbag tightly as I recounted my story to a young volunteer named Sarah. She listened carefully, her brow furrowed with concern as I described the locked door, the note, and the whispers of forged documents. Sarah explained the basics of property law and the rights I still held. She helped me understand that ownership wasn't something easily erased, that forged documents could be challenged, and that there were legal avenues to protect my claim. For the first time, I felt a flicker of hope, a possibility that I could fight back. Together, we began the painstaking process of gathering evidence. I searched through old files to find the original deed to my house, a document I had kept tucked away in a drawer. Holding it in my hands, I felt a surge of determination. This piece of paper was more than just ink and paper, it was proof that I still had a right to the home Brendan and Kayla were trying to claim. With Sarah's guidance, I filed a formal complaint about the suspected forgery and unauthorized attempts to transfer ownership. I sent cease and desist letters demanding that no further action be taken without my consent. Each step was small, but it felt like reclaiming a little piece of my dignity. The emotional toll was immense. Every phone call to lawyers, every visit to the courthouse, reminded me of the betrayal and the growing divide between me and my son. But I refused to let the pain consume me. Instead, I channeled it into resolve, determined to stand my ground. Mrs. Lambert's quiet support was a balm during this difficult time. She would check in regularly, bringing over homemade tea and the occasional loaf of bread. Her presence reminded me that I was not entirely alone, that there were still people who cared and who believed in justice. One afternoon, as I sifted through a stack of documents at the kitchen table, I realized how much had changed. The house that once felt like a sanctuary was now a contested space, a symbol of conflict rather than comfort. Yet, amid the chaos, I found a strange clarity. This fight was no longer just about property, it was about reclaiming my voice and my place in a family that had tried to silence me. I thought about Brendan, about the son I had known and loved. The man who had turned away from me was no longer a boy who needed his mother's care. He was someone who had chosen betrayal over bond. It was a painful realization, but it steeled my resolve. I needed to protect not only my home, but my own sense of worth. With each legal step, I felt the weight on my shoulders lighten just a little. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't invisible. I was fighting back, piece by piece, document by document. The path was daunting and the outcome uncertain, but I was no longer sitting on the porch, waiting for a door to open that might never welcome me again. Instead, I was standing firm, claiming what was rightfully mine. The night was still long, but the first stars appeared, small points of light in the vast darkness. And as I looked up, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for justice yet. The day of the confrontation arrived with a weight I hadn't anticipated. I stood outside the familiar house, the one that had become a battleground between me and Brendan, heart pounding beneath a carefully composed exterior. Ashby, my attorney, was by my side, a steady presence amid the storm of emotions swirling inside me. She had reviewed every document, prepared every argument, and now it was time to face the son who had cast me out. When Brendan opened the door, his face was a mask of surprise quickly replaced by guarded resentment. Kayla stood behind him, her expression tight, as though bracing for the storm that was about to descend. The air was thick with unspoken accusations, years of love and betrayal compressed into a single moment. Ashby wasted no time. She laid out the facts clearly and firmly. The original deed was in my possession, the forged documents were invalid, and any attempts to transfer ownership without my consent were illegal. Brendan's expression flickered, defensive, angry, and then something like shame. But there was no apology, no attempt to explain the cold dismissal that had shattered our family. I looked at Brendan, searching for the son I once knew, the boy who had clung to my hand through scraped knees, who had laughed with abandon in the backyard. Instead, I saw a man hardened by greed and selfishness, willing to sever the ties that bound us for his own gain. The realization was like a punch to the gut. The confrontation was painful and raw. Words were exchanged, sharp, cutting, and final. Brendan accused me of not understanding his life, of being an obstacle to his future. I told him that trust and respect were not so easily discarded, that family was not a transaction to be negotiated and signed away. Kayla's silence spoke volumes. I could see the conflict in her eyes, caught between loyalty and guilt. As the meeting drew to a close, it became clear that the relationship we once shared was fractured beyond repair. Brendan's cold resolve left no room for reconciliation. I felt a deep sorrow, but also a fierce determination not to be further diminished. I had come to claim what was mine, and in doing so, I had to accept that some ties could not be mended. Choosing dignity over bitterness, I made the difficult decision to let go of the house. Not out of defeat, but as a way to reclaim my life and create space for healing. The legal settlement I negotiated provided a foundation, a chance to start anew on my own terms. Walking away from that house was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but as I closed the door behind me, I felt a strange sense of relief. The facade of family unity had crumbled, revealing the truths we had all tried to ignore. In that moment, I chose to assert my boundaries, to protect my heart from further harm. The pain lingered, but so did a growing sense of empowerment. I was no longer a passive victim, but a woman reclaiming control over her story. The path ahead was uncertain, but I knew I had taken the first steps toward freedom. As I left the neighborhood behind, I carried with me the lessons of betrayal and resilience. The house was no longer my sanctuary, but I was determined to build a new home within myself, one defined by strength, dignity, and hope. The apartment was small, but it was mine, a fresh start carved out of the tumultuous aftermath of betrayal. Moving in felt like stepping into unfamiliar territory, both frightening and exhilarating. The walls were bare, the rooms echoing with silence, but I saw potential in the blank spaces. This was not just a place to live, it was a canvas on which I could rebuild my life, piece by piece. I spent the first few days unpacking slowly, carefully arranging my belongings to create a sense of warmth and familiarity. The faded quilt Brendan had made for me years ago found its place draped over the armchair by the window. I hung a few photographs, scenes of gardens I had tended, moments of laughter with friends long gone but never forgotten. Each item was a thread connecting me to my past, even as I stepped into a new chapter. One morning, as sunlight streamed through the window, I planted fresh lavender in a small pot on the sill. The scent was soothing, a gentle reminder of resilience and renewal. Tending to the plant became a daily ritual, grounding me in the present and symbolizing the growth I was nurturing within myself. The community center nearby became my second refuge. I began volunteering there, sharing my story with women who had faced similar betrayals, family fractured, homes lost, trust broken. Their faces reflected the same pain and strength I recognized in myself. Together, we created a space for healing, where stories could be told without judgment and where hope could take root. Speaking at a local event on elder autonomy was a turning point. Standing before a room of attentive listeners, I spoke candidly about my experience, not as a victim, but as a woman reclaiming her voice. The applause that followed was not just for me, but for all who had been silenced, marginalized, or cast aside. I felt a profound sense of purpose, a calling to transform pain into advocacy. The days settled into a new rhythm. Mornings filled with gardening and quiet reflection, afternoons spent at the center, evenings with books and soft music. The loneliness that had once threatened to engulf me softened, replaced by a community of support and the steady beat of self-discovery. I thought often of Brendan and Kayla, not with bitterness, but with a quiet acceptance. Their choices had shaped my journey, but they did not define it. I learned to let go of the past, not to forget, but to free myself from its hold. Each day was an opportunity to nurture my own growth, to bloom again in the light of newfound independence. As the lavender grew lush and fragrant, so did my spirit. The small apartment, once a symbol of loss, became a sanctuary of strength and hope. I no longer looked back with regret, but forward with determination. The story I was writing now was mine alone, a story of resilience, renewal, and the quiet power of healing.